everybody in Year 5. It's Miss Sally and Rusty back again after our story time last week. We hope you've had a nice week and that you've managed to fill your time with lots of interesting things to do and entertaining things to do, hopefully. Maybe some schoolwork, hopefully some schoolwork, and hopefully some reading. We've managed to fill our days. And here we are again a week later, and we're going to share another book with you. Okay, we hope you enjoyed last week's book, the Horrid Henry book. This week we're going to share The Magic Finger by Roald Dahl. So sit back, get comfortable and enjoy. Okay, here we go. The Magic Finger. The farm next to ours is owned by Mr. and Mrs. Gregg. The Greggs have 2 children, both of them boys. Their names are Philip and William. Sometimes I go over to their farm and play with them. I'm a girl and I'm 8 years old. Philip also 8. William's 3 years older. He's 10. What? Oh, all right, he's 11. Last week something very funny happened to the Gregg family, and I'm going to tell you about it as best as I can. Now, the one thing that Mr. Gregg and his 2 boys loved to do more than anything else was to go hunting. Every Saturday morning they would take their guns and go off into the woods to look for an animal or bird to shoot. Even Philip, who was only 8 years old, had his own gun. I can't stand hunting. I just can't stand it. It just doesn't seem right to me that men and boys should kill animals just for the fun. So I used to try and stop William and Philip from doing it. Every time I went over to their farm, I would do my best to talk them out of it, but they only laughed at me. I even sometimes said something once about it to Mr. Gregg, but he just walked past me as if I wasn't there. Then one Saturday morning, I saw Philip and William coming out of the woods with their father, and they were carrying a lovely young deer. It made me so cross, I started shouting at them. The boys laughed and made faces at me, and Mr. Gregg told me to go home and mind your own P's and Q's. Well, that did it. I saw red. And before I was able to stop myself, I did something I never meant to do. I put the magic finger on them, all. Oh dear. I even put it on Mrs. Gregg, and she wasn't even there. I put it on the whole Gregg family. For months I've been telling myself that I would never put the magic finger upon anyone again. Not after what happened to my teacher, old Mrs. Winter. Poor old Mrs. Winter. One day we were in class and she was teaching us spelling. "Stand up," she said to me, "and spell cat." Now, that's an easy one, I said. K-A-T. "You are a stupid little girl," said Mrs. Winter. "I'm not a stupid little girl," I cried. "I'm a very nice little girl." "Go and stand in the corner," said Mrs. Winter. Then I got cross and I saw red, and I put the magic finger on Mrs. Winter good and strong, and almost at once, guess what? Whiskers began growing out of her face. They were long black whiskers, just like the ones you see on a cat, only much bigger. And they, how fast they grew. Before we had time to think, they were out to her ears. Of course, the whole class started screaming with laughter, and then Mrs. Winter said, "Will you be so kind as to tell me what you all find so madly funny?" And when she turned around to write something on the blackboard, we saw that she'd grown a tail as well. It was a huge bushy tail. I cannot begin to tell you what happened after that, but if you're wondering whether Mrs. Winter is okay again now, well, the answer is no, and she never will be. The magic finger is something I've been able to do all my life. I can't tell you how I do it because I don't even know myself. But it always happens when I get cross, when I see red. I get very hot all over, and then the tip of the forefinger of my right hand begins to tingle terribly. And suddenly a sort of flash comes out of me, a quick flash like something electric. It jumps out and touches the person who's made me cross. And after that, the magic finger is upon him or her, and then things begin to happen. Well, the magic finger was now upon the whole Gregg family, and there was no taking it off again. I ran home and waited for things to happen. They happened fast. I shall now tell you what those things were. I got the whole story from Philip and William the next morning after it was all over. In the afternoon of the very same day I put the magic finger on the Gregg family, Mr. Gregg, Philip and William went out hunting once again. This time they were going after wild ducks, so they headed down to the lake. In the first hour they got 10 birds, and in the next hour they got another 6. "Hey, what a day!" cried Mr. Gregg. "This is the best yet." He was beside himself with joy. Just then 4 more wild ducks flew over their heads. They were flying very low and were easy to hit. Bang, 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 bang went the guns. The ducks flew on. "We missed," said Mr. Gregg. "That's funny." Then to everyone's surprise, the 4 ducks turned around and came flying right back to the guns. "Hey," said Mr. Gregg, "what on earth are they doing? Well, they're really asking for it this time." He shot at them again. Pooh, pooh, pooh. And so did the boys. And they missed again. Mr. Gregg got very red in the face. "It's the light. That's what it is. It's getting too dark to see. Let's go home." So they started for home, carrying with them the 16 birds they'd shot before. But the 4 ducks wouldn't leave them alone. They now began flying around and around the hunters as they walked away. Mr. Gregg did not like it one bit. Be off, he cried, and he shot pooh, pooh, at them many more times, but it was no good. He simply could not hit them. All the way home, those 4 ducks flew around in the sky above their heads, and nothing could make them go away. Later that night, after Philip and William had gone to bed, Mr. Gregg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the call of a wild duck in the night sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still, and there was a thin yellow moon over the trees on the hill, and the sky was filled with stars. And then Mr. Gregg heard the noise of wings flying low, flap, 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 low over his head, and he saw the 4 ducks against the night sky, flying very closely together. They were going around and around the house. Mr. Gregg forgot about the firewood and hurried back indoors. He was now quite afraid. He didn't like what was going on, but he said nothing to Mrs. Gregg about it. All he said was, come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired." So they went to bed and went to sleep. When morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up and open his eyes. He was about to put his hand out for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. "That's funny," he said. "Where's my hand?" He lay still wondering what was up. Maybe he'd hurt his hand in some way. He tried the other hand, but that wouldn't come out either. He sat up. And then for the first time he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Gregg woke up And when she saw Mr. Gregg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too. Ah! For he was now a tiny little man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of the chair, but no taller. And where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck wings instead. Oh dear. But, cried Mrs. Gregg, going purple in the face. My dear man, what's happened to you? What's happened to both of us, you mean? Shouted Mr. Gregg. It was Mrs. Gregg's turn now to jump out of bed. She ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg, and she too had got wings instead of arms. Sobbed Mrs. Gregg. This is witch's work, cried Mr. Gregg, and both of them started running around the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had no wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. Mama, 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 chirped Philip. Look, Mama, we can fly. And they flew up in the air. Come down at once. You're much too high. But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown out of the window. That's the end of part 1, okay? If you click straight onto part 2, we'll have a few more minutes of the magic finger, okay? Another instalment, and probably finish the rest of it next week, okay? So stop now, click straight onto part 2.